Hello everyone, and thank you for attending our IDEA virtual user group meeting. This webcast is being recorded and will be available on demand in the next few days. We'll send everyone a link to the recording once it's available. Our presenter today is Kurt Johnson, Manager of Implementation Services. Kurt joined Automation Services almost 5 years ago, and in that time he has assisted many of our clients with continuous monitoring and IDEA server implementations. He also works closely with the IDEA Help Desk team and Professional Services Group to develop customized IDEA scripts and serves as a consultant on sampling projects. Today, Kurt will be discussing monetary unit sampling, from the mechanics and basic theory to how you can construct a sample to meet sampling objectives. Kurt will cover everything you want to know. Kurt, thank you for joining us today to share your expertise. We'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Hello, everybody, and thanks for coming. The goal today is to provide some clarity regarding the approach of monetary unit sampling and to give everybody some deeper insight on the various concepts you must know about to accurately perform monetary unit sampling. That way you'll have a better idea of what to plug in for certain numbers to run MUS in IDEA. I'll start by explaining the concepts, then I'll perform a live demonstration. I'll try to leave time to answer your questions at the end. So let's get started. Monetary unit sampling falls into the realm of general audit sampling techniques. There are two types of sampling that one does with audit, and that is sampling for controls and compliance or sampling for monetary misstatement. With controls and compliance sampling, the resulting answers are either yes or no, or they did or they didn't, and in which case we could employ attribute sampling to perform this sorts of tests for sampling. With monetary misstatement sampling, we're looking to see more into about how much discrepancy exists on our books. There are two types of monetary misstatement sampling that we can perform using IDEA, and that's monetary unit sampling and classical variable sampling. I want to just briefly get into attribute sampling to provide some perspective, and you'll see that some of these things are very similar to some concepts we will discuss with monetary unit sampling later on. Things like the tolerable deviation rate, expected deviation rate, and confidence level will be the same type of inputs you would be using with monetary unit sampling. Attribute sampling is efficient for low error rates, especially. You can get nice smaller samples, even with lower error rates, and you won't get samples that are too big. You can use random or stratified sample selection methods to create samples to employ with attribute sampling here, and it will allow you to plan and evaluate the samples that you create using the random sampling or stratified sample selection methods in IDEA. Getting back to monetary misstatement sampling, well, that's a decision where we have to decide monetary unit sampling or classical variable sampling. In many cases, you could use either one, but here are a few recommendations and some limitations that you may want to know about. The first question we have to ask ourselves is, do you have a lot of errors? If so, you may want to consider using classical variable sampling rather than monetary unit sampling. Monetary unit sampling would be much more appropriate if you expect to find very few errors in the population. And so your expectation of what amount of errors could lead you to choose one or the other. A sampling unit, such as an invoice or other such thing, is an error off by a penny or more. In terms of do you have a lot of errors or very few errors, we define a lot to be about approximately 5% or more of the population has an error. Now, do you require a small sample size less than, say, 100? Monetary unit sampling would be the one to use. I find it very difficult many times to create a sample size less than 100 using classical variable sampling. Do you expect a good amount of understatements? Well, in this case, if that were the case, then you'd want to use classical variable sampling. This is basically because monetary unit sampling employs PPS sample selection, or probability proportional to size, which we'll get into a little bit more later. And that basically means that monetary unit sampling is biased toward detection of overstatements, because it's going to pick the bigger items for the sample. And that means that smaller items, which could be understated, could be left out, and that understatement might not be detected. So that would have to be something to consider. Also, do you have a mixture of negative and positive values? Classical variable sampling might be more appropriate in this case if the number of errors turns out to be high. That's because the monetary unit sampling high error rate evaluation method, which we'll discuss a little bit later, cannot evaluate negative amounts along with positive amounts together. It either has to be one or the other. Also, do you have $0 items that you want to possibly consider for inclusion in your sample? If that's the case, then classical variable sampling would probably be more appropriate, because monetary unit sampling, again due to its PPS sample selection method, will not select items with $0 amounts. They have 0% chance for selection. So what are the goals of monetary unit sampling? Let's say that's what you decided to go with, and that was the most appropriate one for your study. Our goals here are twofold. One, to provide an adjustment factor that the auditor can use to say what the most likely true dollar value of the population is. We call this the most likely error. We also want to be able to judge whether the total population error exceeds the auditor's threshold of material error, and we call this the upper error limit. This threshold of material error we'll call the materiality threshold, which you, the auditor, must decide on a priori. What we're going to do here is we're going to relate the upper error limit to the materiality threshold. By deciding on what the materiality threshold should be, that helps you determine certain inputs when you go in to plan your sample using MUS. These two statistics, most likely error. The most likely error is the point estimate of the total error in the population based on the sample errors. Based on the sample errors you get, we can tell you what the most likely error is as a projection back against the population. And that way you can say, well, I more than likely need to adjust the value of what I think the population value is up or down by this amount. The upper error limit is the greatest possible total error that can exist in the population based on sample errors and what we'll call the basic precision. And this leads us to two rules that I've stated here. And this is where the upper error limit, if it's greater than the materiality threshold, then we have material error. If it's less than or equal to the threshold, we get no material error. This chart here allows me to illustrate a little more visually what I was just talking about there. As you can see here, based on the sample errors, we were able to project the most likely error for the population. On top of that, based on the sample errors and based on our basic precision, which is a statistical judgment of basically how precise the sample can be, we then can project the upper error limit. The upper error limit, for if there's no material error projection, would be something that would lie underneath this predefined materiality threshold. If there is material error, that means that there's possibly more error in the population than the auditor was originally willing to accept. So in this case, we would have to consider other options, such as resampling or suggesting changes to functional areas in terms of record keeping. This is sort of the goal here, is to sort of do this like the game show, The Price is Right. What we want to do is we want to get as close to the bar, the materiality threshold line as possible without going over. If the upper error limit is just underneath, then I know that we have analyzed the smallest possible sample size, the most efficient one, to be able to gauge the auditor's objectives and be able to determine that the materiality threshold had not been breached. At this point, what we want to do is, based on these basic concepts now, we want to integrate them into a workflow for audit sampling. The first step is you have to define your sampling objective. Next thing is you have to define the population from which to sample. This is a very important aspect and is often overlooked. And sometimes people end up with samples they don't want because they didn't pay attention to step number 2. Step number 3 is we need to plan and extract the sample, physically go audit the sample items for correctness, and then finally, based on those findings, evaluate the sample to project our findings back to the population. And we'll go through each of these steps in turn. First step, define the sampling objective. The objective of sampling is for you to make guesses about the population. Draw a sample to test your hypothesis, and then go see if you're correct. The more correct you are about the population, then we can verify that using monetary unit sampling methods. The first thing that you have to decide is what's your materiality threshold. And the materiality threshold is achieved when you understand that you have to make a recommendation at the very end. What is the maximum amount of error that you're willing to accept before you recommend structural change in the controls or bookkeeping processes that you're currently auditing and creating the sample for? Then you have to ask yourself, what do you want to use the sample to conclude? Are company controls are weak or strong? Monetary records, are they well kept or poorly kept? Are you trying to look to gauge sales tax that's been imputed in the amounts? You need a way to be able to break those out, because those were not broken out when the payments were made. You need to look at which areas of the data you want to make conclusions about. You want to consider certain payment types, vendors, domestic business, foreign business. Do you want to say something, conclusion about everything in the data? Or do you want to say something about only a particular set of vendors? Or do you only want to say something about your domestic business and not foreign business, or just foreign business by itself? This allows you to define the scope of how to perform the sample and make so that you can create a sample that does exactly what you want it to do. This goes into defining the population. A very important rule to remember is a sample only says something about the population from which it was drawn. Whatever you define the population to be, that's all that the sample will be able to say something about. What we want to do here is, based on our population, is we want to make sure that it contains all the items we want. We don't want to work with a population that didn't have something that we really wanted to have, and we also want to remove and extract unwanted items from the data so that we can make sure that they don't end up in our sample and we don't end up sampling things that we don't want. Here are some things that we have to do. We want to be able to look at things that are low-risk items. You may not want to go and have a low-risk item in your sample, so you should remove it a priori. We want to look at items that are outside the objective scope. Again, if you're looking to analyze domestic business, let's make sure we get all the foreign transactions out of there. We want to look at items that affect the overall material value of the population, such as reversals that would ultimately say, well, actually, this item was reversed. It doesn't affect the material value of our population. So any reversals you would have to want to make sure that you get rid of before you pull a sample from the population. Or you might find that you have an item in your sample that really was never anything that needed to be sampled to begin with. And again, basically, just remove any items you don't want and that you would never want to have wind up in your sample. Next, we have to plan the sample. We're going to do this based on the sampling objectives and the population, based on the work we just talked about doing. Then we can use that to do the following. We can define the confidence level, the tolerable error, the expected error, with an understanding of the predicted sum of tolerable taintings, and basic precision pricing. We can use those to help plan the sample and generate a sample size that will fit our objectives. Basically, with monetary unit sampling planning, the objective here is to be able to fill out this screen so that you get a sample that meets your sampling objectives. We have the areas such as confidence level, the tolerable error, the expected error. We have changes to basic precision pricing, as well as we have the sum of tolerable sample taintings, which allows us to be able to get a preview of how much error our sample will allow us to have. So let's talk about the first thing, the choice of confidence level. The confidence level should be based on how dependent you're going to be on this sample. The more dependent you're going to be on sample results to draw conclusions, the higher the confidence level you'll want for the sample. Now, if you don't want to rely as much on the sample to tell you things, but rather you're willing to rely very highly on controls, but none on analytical review, then you could sit there and say, well, I could set my sampling risk at 30%, and 1 minus 30% is 70%, and you could set that as your confidence level. Now, you can't rely as much on the sample, but you have lots of controls that you can rely on, so that's okay. On the other hand, if the controls are not reliable and an analytical review is not reliable, then you may want to sit there and set more of a sampling risk of 5%, which would lead to a confidence level of 95%. When you increase the confidence level, the sample size increases, and vice versa. The tolerable error. The higher the number for the tolerable error, the less precise the estimate. Precision is sort of a counterintuitive number in that the higher the number, it indicates less precision. When we increase the tolerable error, our basic precision at the very end, when we do our projections, that increases, that making our point estimate of the most likely error less reliable. As we increase the tolerable error, the upper error limit increases, meaning that you have more of a chance to breach the materiality threshold. What we want to set this to is somewhat less than your materiality threshold, so we can allow for unfavorable point estimators. This is how we get where we can get right under that line without going over. And what we want to do is generally we look at the total value of the population, and we set some sort of percentage cut. So if you had a $10 million population and you wanted 5% from it, then you would be looking at $500,000 of error. So you would want to be able to set the percentages, the tolerable error, to be roughly where your materiality threshold would be. So what we want to do is we want to govern the tolerable error, also governs the amount of basic precision in your results. As you increase the tolerable error, you decrease the sample size. As you decrease the tolerable error, you increase the sample size. The reason why is because when you increase the sample size, the larger samples are able to say more about the population than smaller samples. And so what that means is that when the precision number goes down, that's essentially making your confidence intervals less wide, meaning you can say more confidently that most likely error is within this particular smaller range because you have a larger sample to deal with. The expected error. The expected error is the amount of error you most likely expect to see in the population in the sample. An error is any difference, again, between recorded and audited amounts. What percentage of the time do you think an error will occur? This is not a question of the weighted dollar value of percent of error. What we want to do is we're going to base this on the auditor's confidence in the accuracy of the bookkeeping. So what you want to do is you want to look and say, how reliable is their bookkeeping process? Are they using an ERP system, which has many checks and balances built in? Are they manually entering information into Excel? Are they doing paper and pencil record keeping and using file cabinets? And how many levels of checks and balances do they have? Is this one person responsible for entering the information, or are there other people that come along and double check what has been done? What you'll find here is that when you increase the expected error, it increases the sample size. When you decrease the expected error, you decrease the sample size. And it's important to note here that setting the expected error to 0 means the sample has no tolerance for any errors. Basically, that means that the upper error limit will breach the materiality threshold if even just a penny of error is found in the samples that are generated when you put the expected error to 0. Now, this will an expected error of 0 for a given confidence level and tolerable error will result in the smallest possible sample size. But you'll pay for that reduction in sample size if any errors occur. The sum of tolerable taintings is what we can use to understand that concept I just talked about. A tainting is the absolute percentage difference between recorded book entry amounts and the true audit amounts. Basically, we're just talking about percentage difference of error, right? So tainting is, you can see the formula right here. The sum of tolerable taintings tells you how much total percentage error you can have or tolerate before you exceed the upper error limit. As I was just mentioning, this is controlled by the expected error. The higher the expected error, the higher the sum of tolerable taintings will be, and the more robust the sample will be to being able to absorb errors while delivering a below materiality threshold result. Also, of course, the lower you set the expected error, the lower the sum of tolerable taintings, and more likely that an error could get you an upper error limit result that will be above the materiality threshold. Basic precision pricing. Basic precision is the upper error limit when no errors are found in the sample. So think about that for a minute. How much error that we still have in the sample without actually finding any errors when we went and audited the items? That's basically because what the basic precision reflects is how much the sample can say about the population. And as I was saying before, larger samples can say more than smaller samples. And this makes intuitive sense. If we were to go out and poll one person for president and they said they voted for the a person from one particular party, and they sat there, we went and said, oh, well, that means this person is going to be president. Nobody would buy that, because a sample of 1 is just simply imprecise. So what the basic precision basically tells you is how precise the sample can be. Basic precision pricing is how we determine the weight of this basic precision. It determines the weight of the errors and functions as an upper bound for the most allowable individual tainting or percentage error per record. Basic precision pricing can be set both during the planning and the evaluation stages in IDEA. For our uses for this, well, we can use BPP to raise or lower the basic precision to achieve changing tolerable misstatement materiality objectives. Let's say you wanted to move your materiality threshold after you had pulled your sample and went and audited the items. When you do the evaluation, you could change the BPP to change the basic precision without affecting your sampling interval or any projection made with it. You could also use BPP in the planning stage to lower the sample size if you can verify prior to sampling that there is a ceiling on the amount of tainting that can occur for any one item. The lower you set BPP, the smaller the sample size. The higher it is, the larger your sample size. Once you have done this, and you'll move to the extract the sample stage. What we do there is we could say, we need to now make a couple choices, but then we could go ahead and generate our sample. And the things we're going to look at is we're going to look at the extraction type, high value handling. These things here we'll discuss during the demo, and then of course here's where you enter your file names and maybe the file name for the high value items file. Monetary unit sample extraction employs PPS. PPS is probability proportional to size. That means that the probability of selecting any individual physical unit, such as an invoice, is proportional to its size. It means the larger the dollar value of the item, the more likely it is to be selected for the sample. Very small items have very small chance of being selected in this case. But what that does is it helps ensure that the sample contains few, if any, smaller dollar units that don't affect the materiality all that much. Because the last thing you'd want to do is sit there and go and say, well, since errors are based on percentage difference, you wouldn't want to say go audit a $1 item, find that there's 50 cents of error, and then conclude that the sum of tolerable taintings for that item is 50%. And if that gets you above your sum of tolerable taintings, then you would breach the materiality threshold with your upper error limit, as we discussed earlier. With this, let's talk about the fixed interval versus cell selection. And in order to best describe what the difference is between these two methods, you kind of have to understand the actual physical process of monetary unit sampling. So think about it like this. We're going to line up all the dollars from the first dollar to the last individual dollar. And that's what these sorts of rows here represent, these row blocks here. So you can see here we have one for monetary unit sampling cell selection and one for fixed interval selection. If the population, say, totals to $1 million, there will be 1 million individual dollars that could be picked from as we move through across this line. What we're doing here is in this case, our sampling interval is $8,783. And what this is used to do is it's used to define cells starting from the first dollar all the way to the last. And what we'll do is define these cells according to these solid lines. And you can see that these are chosen based on this particular interval right here. Then what we do is these are the cell boundaries, and these are the cells themselves between the cell boundaries. Now with cell selection, as you can see by the checkered lines, what we're doing here is we can pick randomly within each cell what dollar we're going to choose. With fixed interval, we pick a random starting point and jump based on the sampling interval to the same relative spot in each of the cells. So you see we're jumping by 8783 each time, whereas here we're jumping by a different amount between the dollar amounts each time. So this picks a new random spot within each cell, the cell selection, and the fixed interval picks within the same relative spot. Sometimes if the data is systematically laid out, then it may be better to use cell selection. If on the other hand there's pretty much a random scattering of the dollars, then in terms of their invoices, and there's no structural say ordering to them, then fixed interval selection would probably be more recommended. The reason for this is because sometimes with cell selection is you might pick a dollar all very close to the right side of this cell, and then pick one very close to the left side of the next cell. Sometimes that will result in you picking the dollars for the same invoice, and then that means you would have the invoice duplicated. So sometimes with fixed interval selection, we can make sure that doesn't happen. And that's, of course, what happens when we go and alight on one of these dollars with these checkered lines, is whatever invoice or physical unit that is associated with this individual dollar, say $21,260, that's the invoice or physical unit that is chosen. So that's basically how monetary unit sampling works, as it goes through all the dollars and alights within each cell on a particular dollar, and then pulls the physical unit or invoice related to that dollar. High value amounts. In monetary unit sampling, the default cutoff is the sampling interval, and these are based on duplicates. We don't want duplicates in our sample in many cases because it's a bit confusing. So, but we can certainly have it that way, but we don't necessarily. But in a lot of cases, we'll want to make sure that we extract high value amounts out to a separate file. High value items are not subject to statistical projection, and the associated errors are added directly to the bottom line. And this is true for both most likely error and the upper error limit. In IDEA, there are two options. There's the in-sample as aggregate option, where again could potentially duplicate the selection of any items greater than the sampling interval. Now, when we went through the planning stage, though, it would calculate a sample size for us. In this case, if you use in-sample as aggregate, the estimated sample size will be retained. Using the in-database option, though, will eliminate the generation of duplicates by removing items to another IDEA database prior to selecting the sample. Thus, the estimated sample size could be lower now that the large dollar amounts are removed from the population. During the planning stage, we were doing our planning with all of the dollars available. Now, but by basically saying, take all of the items that are greater than the sampling interval and remove them to a file, we now may find that we have fewer dollars to jump through, and that could result in a smaller sample size. So it's always very important to figure out what the high value items are and to see what their effect is on your material misstatement. Once we've extracted the sample, we need to double check the sample and then go audit the sample items. So first we need to scrutinize the sample for unwanted items before performing the in-depth audit of the items. Make sure this allows you want to make sure you properly define the population, and you want to check by checking for unwanted invoice numbers, type codes, dates out of scope, etc. Finally, you need to find verifiable proof using physical invoices, bills of lading, or other proof from vendors. This allows you to go get the true value of what the items are. And then once you know the true values, then what we can do is we can go evaluate the sample. And these are the two screens available for evaluating samples. And this is the one for single sample, and we have one for multiple samples. What you'll find is the confidence level and the value of the sample population is generally just filled in for you if you use planning for monetary unit sampling. And we can also, it'll fill in the sample size based on that amount that you have. If you had high value items in a file, you'd want to select through this ellipsis button here and be able to navigate and allow it to know what the high value items are. And you can choose with either low error rate or high error rate. With multiple samples, we can come in here and append additional IDEA databases here, and then allow it to evaluate using very much similar, almost exactly the same inputs as we have for single sample. With evaluation, our goal is to see if the upper error limit exceeds the materiality threshold, and also to obtain the most likely error. The MUS evaluation method I want to point out, can also be used to evaluate samples that were prepared using other sample planning techniques. For example, if you used random sampling or stratified random sampling in IDEA to create a sample without using monetary unit sampling planning, you could still go through and apply the evaluation module of monetary unit sampling to those samples and be able to project results for the population and get an upper error limit and most likely error. We have three types of evaluation. There's the single sample cell evaluation, which has two types, as I pointed out, low error rate and high error rate. We also have the multiple sample stringer bound evaluation, and I'll discuss that next. With cell evaluation, we have with low error rate, this is the one most typically used, and it supplies separate overstatements and understatements calculations, which I'll show you during our demo next. The high error rate allows you to set the precision limits to upper and lower at the very bottom. Those are grayed out when low error rate is selected. The high error rate, as I mentioned before, cannot accommodate negative and positive values together. So items must be either all positive or all negative, or otherwise, if there's high error rate, we'd have to use classical variable sampling in this case. And this error, the high error rate is useful when the number of errors approaches or exceeds 20. And classical variable sampling is actually very much related to this because those techniques are used to actually do the evaluation. Another limitation of this one is it will not break down overstatements versus understatements. The stringer bound evaluation is, I want to point out, the multiple sample evaluation can also be used to evaluate a single sample as well as multiple samples. So you can actually use it to, you could run the evaluation with cell and then run it again with the multiple sample evaluation with one sample and get slightly different results. The stringer bound evaluation is more conservative. It produces a slightly higher upper error limit and increases the chance that you'll exceed the materiality threshold. So if you want to employ a more conservative approach, especially if you got really close to the threshold with cell evaluation, you may want to rerun again with the stringer bound evaluation with multiple samples to see if you by chance get over the breach the threshold with the upper error limit that is calculated with that technique. As you can see here, not very well, but when you look real close, we can produce similar output with these, with all three of these different evaluation methods. And I'll show each of these to you a little more closely here in just a second. But as you can see here, they all have the same basic layout in terms of what is presented. So if you understand one, you understand the others. Low error rate summary. This is where, with this evaluation, you can see that it'll generate the sample size, the number of errors, tell you what the most likely error is, and net upper error limit for the samples you create. If you have high value items in a file, those will be evaluated separately. And you can see, and then what we'll have here, as you can see, that we will have the results of the high value items together with the ones from the sample in order to be able to provide the ultimate overall results. And it will draw conclusions for you and basically, based on the numbers, tell you in English what is going on and how to interpret the numbers. And again, here's the high error rate, and you can see we don't have the overstatement understatement breakdown, but we do have basically the same information presented. You can see here again we get very similar layouts for the combined sample evaluation, and this one was actually used on the same sample that we used 2 slides ago. So you can see, you notice that the results are kind of similar, but that the net upper error limit is slightly higher, as I pointed out before. So let's go to IDEA, and let's see what it would take to create a sample using MUS. So what we'll do here is, let's say we started with this set of sample of bank transactions, which has negative and positive values in it. And I want to look at deposits only, and so what I did is I ran an extraction to get all the deposit types. If we go here and sort the data, we can see that there are some $0 values here. These we know right away will not be selected for the sample. As long as we're okay with that, we can proceed. one thing we may want to do this for is if I expect if it's possible that I could get high error rates here, then I would definitely want to make sure that all of the deposits are positive, which they are, so that I could use the high error rate evaluation if needed. In which case, if I wanted to do checks, I may want to separate those out to get all the negatives in a different file and perform 2 different samples. Then what we could do is we'll come up here and say, all right, we need to perform monetary unit sampling, and let's go plan. And so we'll start our plan. And when we started out, we decided that we didn't want to rely on analytical review, and we don't want to rely on controls. So, because we decided those were just simply unreliable. So what we'll do is we'll put in our confidence level of 95%, and we'll look at our value of the sample population. So based on deposits, we have about $11 million worth of deposit. And based on our materiality threshold, we're going to set that as at about approximately 5% of that. So if we have a materiality threshold of about 5%, we'll go with something about 5% for tolerable error. We may even want to go in and say 4.8%. So then what we can do is we can take our expected error and we can say, well, what is that going to be? Well, first off, let's click an estimate and see what we're up against. With a tolerable error of 4.8%, then we would have to sample 61 items from the population. And as we discussed before, the sum of tolerable taintings is 0. You may accept the population at the 95% confidence level when no more than 0 taintings are observed in the sample size 61. So as I said before, this means that you'd have 0 chance for error. If we put in, say, 0.5, now we can accept up to 37% for the sum of tolerable taintings, which now allows us to absorb some error if we sample an additional 14 items. If we set this to be even higher and estimate again, we now have to sample 96 items, but now we can have almost 100% of tolerable error in that tolerable taintings, excuse me, in the sample. So let's say we accept that, and we come in and we look at fixed interval, and we have to make choices here. So let's say we have we can choose high values in sample as aggregate and high values in database. First off, let's go ahead and look at the in sample as aggregate. So if we did monetary sample in aggregate, and we click OK. This will generate a sample that looks like this. And as you can see here, we have these very large items that got duplicated a bunch of times, and we have 96 items here. Now what we can do here, we can say, well, if we wanted to, we could keep it this way. We can go audit this item here of $3.8 million, and whatever our finding is for the true audit value, we just put it in all of these cases, in which case it will evaluate the same and give you the same results as if you'd used high value items in a file. If we rerun the task and instead choose high values in database, we could get a monetary sample with high values in file, and have a high values file for the demo. Then what we could do is click OK, and now you can see that we now are down to 29 items which is much less than what we originally thought we had, and that's because 4 of the items went into the high value items file. And the reason why they did so is because they're greater than the sampling interval, which is how we could see if we looked at the in aggregate sample that these were chosen more than once. So let's say we went here and we went and audited these 4 items for the high values, and we found that this one was $130,000 in reality. And then what we can do here is go to our original sample and say, well, remember, we were able to tolerate, what, 96% error. So that means if we came here and we made this $10,000, the expectation is that shouldn't kill us, because that would be about a little over 50% percentage difference error, or a little over 50% tainting. So then what we can do is, let's say these were the only 2 errors that we found. Then what we would do is we come here, we could evaluate the sample. With lower error rate, since we only found a couple errors, we have it fills in our information for us, we'll make sure to select our high value items file. And then what we can do here is say, let's make sure that we have everything set up, and we have our monetary sampling evaluate single sample by default. And this will allow us to get a summary. And with this summary, we can see ultimately what the effects are for the projections of the sample based on the errors we found. And we have the projection of the most likely error, and we have the projection of the upper error limit. We also can see which of these items are in error, and we can see what the value of the errors from our high value items file. When we originally set our tolerable error at 4.8%, well, we could say, well, 4.8% times the 11 million gives us a materiality threshold of $528,000. And what we could do here is we can then go and say, well, after we did all that, did we get underneath? We sure did. So in this case, we can be sure that the maximum amount of error is going to be less than the $528,000 that we said we could tolerate to begin with. So in this sense, our total percentage errors are actually less than our total percentage errors, or sum of tolerable taintings, was 50% or so, and we could tolerate 96% when we did this. And what you can do here is you can come in here and see what the calculations were for understatements and overstatements by clicking these buttons here. So this tells us we had one overstatement in our sample, and we were able to see, based on these factors, we can see what the total this is the 52.96% tainting, and then we can see how those calculations are used to calculate the most likely error, as well as the basic precision, which is based on this factor here, the upper error limit. And so this allows you to kind of see from the beginning to the end how we would go and create a sample, evaluate the sample, and look at the results to see based on our sampling objectives that we defined to begin with. So at this point, I'd like to open the floor for questions. I see some of you guys have submitted questions during this. The first question: how did you split the population into two tabs, the high value and remaining samples? When we did that, we did in IDEA. If we come back to the sample, rerun, we changed that by using the high values and database option. This is how we split those greater than the sampling interval into another database. And of course, we can also have in sample as aggregate, where everything can be together. The next question is the tolerable error percent you used in determining sample size unique to this population, or based on your tolerable error for the overall engagement? The tolerable error percent you use is defined based on your materiality threshold, and you want to be able to use the one that's a materiality threshold that you set for the population. You don't set the materiality threshold based on the overall engagement. And the reason for this, again, is because the sample can only say something about the population from which it was drawn. So we want to make sure that the tolerable error percentage that we use to address the materiality threshold for the population is based on the population and not some other aspects that are involved in your overall engagement. So, because you can't use a sample to say something about anything other than the population from which it was drawn. So we can't draw from the AP records and then use that sample to say something about accounts receivable records. So let's see what the next question. What would be the next steps if the upper error limit is greater than our threshold? Well, the next steps could be if you were to you could go and if you're close to the materiality threshold, but you've gone a little bit over, you could do some more sampling of the items by coming in and generating another sample, and then taking that sample and employing the multiple samples evaluation. Let's go here. And then we could go in and find that other sample and say append it to it. And then once we've done that, then we can go through and evaluate as before. And our last question, can you use monetary unit sampling for sales tax review? Yes, you can actually. We've been talking about monetary misstatement in the context of errors, but if you change the context of the error to be actually the tax, then you could use this to say, let's say that these amounts here for deposits contain the amounts plus tax, and we weren't able to separate out the tax. So what we'd want to do here is we could sit here and say, well, this is actually $20,000, meaning that there was $1,258 worth of tax. Then we could say, well, this one here is, say, maybe $65,000, etc. And we do this for all of them. And then we would evaluate using the high error rate evaluation, because all of them, or most of them, will have a tax associated with them. And then you could sit there and take the error, what we call the error, but the error represents the tax, and project that error back to the population to see how much tax actually exists in the population. And that would allow you to do sales tax review. And that, I think, concludes everything from my end.
Thank you, Kurt. You gave us a full demonstration on how to create, evaluate, interpret results derived from samples. If you need assistance in performing any of the techniques Kurt shared with us today, please contact the IDEA Help Desk at 888-641-2800, select option 4, or you can send them an email at helpdesk@automation.com. You can also contact Kurt directly at kurtj@automation.com or the number on your screen. Just as a reminder, we also have videos available on demand, including webcasts from fellow IDEA users and short how-tos. We invite you to visit our website and navigate to the training tab, where you'll find some great resources. We'll be hosting virtual user groups quarterly, and if you would like to share your expertise with others, please contact me for details at lindsayf@automation.com. Thank you all again, and we hope you enjoyed it.